My name is Addison Field. I'm the Chief Curator of the Alaska State Museums. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'd like to start by thanking the Occoquan and the Tlingit Nation, in whose homeland we hold this meeting tonight, and in whose village site we are currently gathered. The lecture tonight is a part of a speaker series organized as a part of the museum's current exhibit, Mug Up, the Language of Cannery Work. We will have two more speakers in this series. In September, House Leader from the Kiksadi, Andy Abona, will join us, and in October, poet, civil rights, and labor activist Oscar Peñaranda is on the schedule. More information about the format and content of those lectures will be published on the museum's website when it becomes available. When I started putting together notes about how I might introduce our speaker tonight, a couple of old Waylon Jennings songs started rolling around in my brain. You know, nothing specific, no lyrics, no quotes, but as Waylon would have said, he's a great person of this country and an old school man of the world. That may sound like high prose, but it is fitting for a person who was news director at KDLG in Dillingham for 17 years, press secretary for Governor Tony Knowles, legislative assistant for Arctic Oceans and Fisheries to U.S. Senator Mark Begich, and a published historian of Bristol Bay and fisheries history. Now, despite that resume, I kept coming back to a hastily written description in an email from one of the museum staff members here, and I realized that I couldn't say it better than this. Bob is a celebrity in this state, and the more that I work with him, I understand why. He's an amazing collaborator on Mug Up and very generous with his time. I think that's the best description of our speaker tonight. Please give a warm welcome to fish historian Bob King.
Well, thank you, Addison. That was very, very nice. And welcome to all of you too here today. It's great to see so many friends and others who I don't know, and welcome their interest in fishing history in Bristol Bay and elsewhere, and the like. It's appropriate that the APK invited me on this first Friday to talk about this subject because of the Mug Up presentation that's going over next door. Katie Ringsmith led that program. She lived in South Naknek for a long time and really knew and understood the cannery history there. And asked me to pitch in as well, and I was pleased to help. My focus today is actually on the Bristol Bay sailboats, why they were there in the first place, and why did they last so long? They were one of the last sailboat fisheries in America. There are a few little small ones around, but this was a large sailboat fishery with over 1,000 boats every year. So I want to focus on these sailboats. You can see their design; they're pretty basic, and also the growth of internal combustion engines at the turn of the century, and why that wasn't an impact at the time. The forces of change that were why those engines were banned in Bristol Bay for the first half of the 20th century, and the forces of change that prompted that ban to be overturned, and the long forgotten battle that emerged over fishing sailboats and power in Bristol Bay. And the power I'm talking about is not what powered the boats. For people For people who are not familiar with southwestern Alaska, Bristol Bay is the world's largest, it's in yellow there, it's largest sockeye salmon fishery. In its 133-year history, the bay has produced over 2 billion sockeye salmon. Prior to, and those fish were worth $250 million last year. Prior to statehood, it was the richest fishery in Alaska. Bristol Bay drove the Alaska's economy, and it continues to do so. This year, in fact, they're expecting a return of 75 million salmon, and they haven't sent the prices yet, so can't guess about that yet. But for the first half of that history, Bristol Bay fishermen worked exclusively from sailboats. And let me say, these were actually beautiful boats in a lot of respects. They were pretty simple yet, simple, rugged, with few creature comforts. They had beautiful lines, though, a distinctive sail, and were a highly effective workboat. But nostalgia aside, why were fishermen in Bristol Bay, again, one of the nation's most lucrative fisheries, forced to work with sailboats while the rest of the world converted to power? You often hear that conservation is cited as the reason, but was that really true? That's the question I hope to answer today. And the story starts at the turn of the 20th century. With the development of gasoline engines, relatively strong and light, it brought a revolution in transportation. Henry Ford used them to put America on the road. Gasoline engines propelled the Wright brothers into the air, and they quickly found their way into the commercial fishing fleet. Fishermen embraced the new technology, and for good reason. Motors made it easier to get to the grounds and come back with their catch. Power winches and rollers reduced the physical labor. Pacific fishermen said one good haul of fish paid for the engine that had been installed in their boat many, many times over. By 1906, the Columbia River fleet had mostly converted their boats, where these originated, into power. But in Alaska's Bristol Bay, fishermen remained under sail. About 24 canneries operated there every year, using about 1,200 fish boats, and pulled in an annual catch of 15 to 20 million sockeye. Back then, fish traps were the favored means of catching fish. But the strong tides and shallow waters of Bristol Bay favored the use of gill nets. The boat of choice was the Columbia River boat. Depending on its maker, they measured up to 30 feet in length with a beam of 7 to 9 feet. They were made from oak and cedar. They were sturdy workboats with few comforts. The sailboat came when the first canneries were built in the 1880s. Plans to convert them were already available, but the power boats were slow in coming. For an industry that still was largely powered by wind, the cost of conversion and fuel storage were obstacles. And since Bristol Bay's fleet was entirely owned by the canneries, there was no entrepreneurial incentive to change. But widespread conversion to power reached Alaska after World War I. In 1922, the powerboat revolution converged on Bristol Bay from two different directions. First, from the south came the floating cannery Santa Flavia. Its owners tried for years to build a cannery in Bristol Bay, but found all the suitable land locked up, mainly by bogus homestead claims that were staked by the other canneries. Then from the north came Carlisle Packing. It operated a floating cannery on the Yukon River, but was shut down to protect the river's subsistence users. Because there were no independent fishermen to hire, Carlisle, actually both, brought their own boats. And because space was limited on board, they brought power boats. Not just power boats either. They brought purse seiners, and both did quite well. Fishing off Ugashik, the Santa Flavia's captain boasted his seiners could load both their boats with a single haul of their net. The Carlisle did even better. They boasted their purse seine could make one haul of their net, and like during the season, their 3 boats caught a total of over 700,000 salmon, all caught offshore. One day they went out there, and one of the boats caught what was estimated to be 65,000 salmon in one haul, and those 65,000 salmon filled up 3 boats, all 3 of them. Its total catch that year was over 700,000, so big, a third of it had to be farmed out to competitors. Now, this posed a valid conservation problem. These waters off of Ugashik, where they were fishing, was a mixing ground for the fish, and there was already a serious conservation problem in Bristol Bay. In 1919, 3 years earlier, Bristol Bay runs collapsed under the weight of fishing that was virtually unregulated at the time. There were just 2 regulations, in fact, at the books back then. One prohibited obstructions in salmon streams. The other required a weekly closed period. But Bristol Bay was exempted. Industry said bad weather allowed for adequate escapement. Charles Henry Gilbert, the premier ichthyologist of the day, later said that the exemption had no valid reason other than the desires of the salmon packers. And when sent to study the 1919 collapse, he criticized the government, or rather the lack of administration of the fisheries, which had the expectation that men would hold their hands where a further profit could be made. And as long as the present policy is continued, there can only be one outcome. Total exhaustion of the fisheries will occur, if not tomorrow, then the day afterwards. Despite such tough words, the packers dragged their feet. For 3 years, they didn't propose any new restrictions on themselves until the arrival of 2 potent competitors. Suddenly, they sprung into action. The 2 competitors, of course, were the Carlisle and Santa Flavia. They backed a plan by President Warren G. Harding to create the Southwest Alaska Fishery Reservation that established regulatory areas for Bristol Bay, Kodiak, and Cook Inlet. And then they proposed regulations that were directly aimed at the Carlisle and Santa Flavia. They said the Alaska packers already operated 9 canneries in Bristol Bay, but they wanted to limit the fishery to existing canneries themselves. They wanted to ban floating canneries, like the Santa Flavia, prohibit purse seines, which they were using, and lastly, ban powerboats. Can you imagine what this means? Alaska's representative to Congress, Dan Sutherland, called it for what it was, describing the APA as the great monopolists of Bristol Bay. And in the end, the canneries didn't get what they wanted. They didn't ban floating canneries, but the ban on purse seines and powerboats in Bristol Bay was written into law, and it remained It remained there when the reservation idea was replaced in 1924 by a more comprehensive federal act known as the White Act. While fishermen were stuck in sailboats, the industry realized the advantages of power. In the 20s, they scrapped their fleet of tall ships in favor of steam and diesel. You could see the change in their advertising. This was a Libby's ad featuring its sailing fleet at Lake Union. It was replaced by a picture of the smoke-belching steamer. And other disadvantages of sail were also becoming increasingly apparent. A cannery from Chignik needed a tow back into San Francisco when it was becalmed. It was becoming harder and harder to find experienced seamen. Replacement masts, spars, even sailcloth was as hard to find as buggy whips. And no sooner had the powerboat prohibition was written into law than its shortcomings became apparent. Among other things, the White Act included, at long last, a weekly closed period. But the weekend closures weren't set according to the bay's 25-foot tides, forcing sailboats to fight the swift currents. The packers needed to get their boats to and from the fishing grounds, so the canneries started to use tugboats to pull them. They later became known as monkey boats, after British sailors' slang. But think about it. Motors don't improve a net's ability to catch fish. Their efficiency is just in faster delivery. The Federal Bureau of Fisheries concluded that towing sailboats had the same effect as if motors were put on the boats themselves. So in 1925, Fishery Commissioner Henry O'Malley ordered the canners to stop towing their boats and said if they didn't, he'd cut back their fishing time. The canners ignored him. O'Malley's threats were meaningless, basically. In-season management was non-existent at the time. He couldn't shorten fishing time until the following year. In the years that followed, O'Malley continued to complain about what he called the promiscuous towing of sailboats. But again, the industry didn't do anything to curb the practice. In 1928, O'Malley offered a compromise, allowing for the use of towboats, but only during closed periods. Again, he was ignored. By 1929, O'Malley was in their face. In a feisty annual meeting with the packers, he again threatened to shorten the season if they didn't stop towing boats, and added indignantly it would be the last time he discussed the matter. It was. The packers responded with new technology. They put the motors on their power scows instead. If they couldn't tow their fishermen to the tally scows, they could make the tally scows come to the fishermen. So with power scows and monkey boats, the Bureau of Fisheries concluded the prohibition against power as a conservation measure was if not entirely, circumvented. O'Malley never mentioned the matter again, but he made a good on his threats on adding a second weekly closed period to allow for escapement. And he carved out closed waters that eventually became many of the fishing districts that we have today. And the issue was dropped. Bristol Bay had the dubious distinction of being the last commercial sailboat fishery on the Pacific. The Trade Journal made fun of the restriction, invoking religious tones. As they were in the beginning, they are now and ever shall be, unless the Bureau of Fisheries changes its mind. But more pressing concerns in the 30s pushed sailboats to the back burner. The economic depression that followed the stock market crash in 1929 had the industry on the run. I love the use of a caveman as depicting the industry. Industry was on the run, chased by low prices for salmon, increasing labor rest in the 30s. Despite the use of sailboats, Bristol Bay still had serious conservation concerns. In 1935, the season was almost canceled, but a limited fishery was allowed as fishery managers experimented with in-season management for the first time and to accommodate many of the local fishermen. Remember the Santa Flavia, the boat that started this all. She appeared in an ad for batteries and continued to operate in the bay, hiring mostly resident fishermen, some of the most first independent fishermen in the bay. But she met a tragic end in 1936 when a cutting torch ignited bilge oil while being outfitted near Seattle, killing one crewman. A Fuhrer was created in 1937 when Japanese fishing boats were spotted fishing off Ugashik. They claimed to be researching salmon migration patterns, but processing ships followed in their wake, showed their intent, and was more commercial than scientific. Industry called it an invasion, and diplomatic efforts ultimately stopped the fishery, but it led to many it demonstrated the imperial ambitions that soon led towards World War II. When Dutch Harbor was bombed just a few years later, the fishing industry replied, "We told you so." The war brought profound changes to the salmon industry and Bristol Bay. Like the rest of the nation, the salmon industry threw itself into the war effort. Canners built ammo boxes and torpedo casings for military use. Fishing boats were commandeered. Cannery operations were curtailed by a lack of basic supplies like tin and rope. But the biggest impact was on manpower. Most cannery workers and fishermen were needed for the military and other wartime industries. Salmon was still needed, though, to feed the troops, so the canners looked to alternative labor markets, like women. Previously ignored, women were put to work on the canning lines, just like Rosie the Riveter. The industry called them war workers on the food front. And in Bristol Bay, they hired many native women. Previously, native hire was almost non-existent, but it quadrupled during the war. That created 1,500 jobs for local residents. Bristol Bay's economy was forever changed. Alaska natives not only went to work in the canneries, they enlisted in the military, went through boot camp, and fought around the globe. And as the saying goes, how are you going to keep them down on the farm once you've given them a bazooka? When the war ended, these soldiers returned to Bristol Bay with training, discipline, a whole new worldview, and an attitude. And when they got home, they didn't like what they see. These are pictures from the trade magazines in 1946, right after the war. Fishermen were being tempted with top secret technology like radar and sonar. Tuna fishermen were using helicopters to spot fish. Cannery operators brought new modern airplanes to use for their use. During the war, the King Salmon Airport in Naknek was built. The war to take care of airplanes headed out to the Aleutians. For the first time in 1946, cannery crews were being flown to Bristol Bay rather than riding on sail ships. And Chevron started tanker service to Bristol Bay. Fuel was no longer a problem. But what did Bristol Bay fishermen see when they returned from the war? Just sailboats. This picture actually found its way into an advertisement that called these boats picturesque. Fishermen might use another word for it. A week before the war ended, South Naknek fisherman Gus Stagg telegrammed recently elected Washington Senator Warren Magnuson that said 100 fishermen at the cannery that would later be known as Bumblebee had signed a petition calling for the rejection of the powerboat prohibition. The following year, the Alaska Fishermen's Union polled its members, and predictably, they came out strongly, 88% in favor of powerboats. A union leader said if Congress forces us to fish in those sailboats, they ought to start a movement back to the horse and buggy. They ought to give the Army bows and arrows and the Navy dugout canoes instead of the billions they're getting for the A-bomb. You might think by now the packers might agree, but industry was far from convinced. They continued, they said that relaxation of the sailboat restriction would leave the service with no control. And their members, the fellow cannery operators, refused to consider making a change, even as an eventuality. The Fish and Wildlife Service didn't buy it. Over the past 15 years, the operators have done everything possible to minimize the importance of this. The monkey boats and power scows have nullified the prohibition on the use of motor-propelled fishing boats as a conservation measure. Murray admitted he had other concerns. Converting their obsolete fleet would cost millions of dollars at a time when salmon runs were in steep decline. Sailboats had obviously failed as a conservation measure. Meanwhile, a fleet of new freezer ships were being built, many on old Liberty ships and other military surplus hulls that posed a greater competitive threat than the Santa Flavia. But the freezer ships weren't practical if they had to depend on sailboats. Milt James told industry to come up with a transition plan for a quick switch to power. But the canners stonewalled it. They did nothing. Some fishermen started taking matters into their own hands. In 1948, two Dillingham fishermen, Frank Wood and Nels Headland, bolted an Evinrude onto their tiller, and they were caught. They pled guilty, forfeited the motor, valued at $125, and it was the first and only conviction of violating the sailboat rule. Meanwhile, other voices were chiming in on the issue. The Territorial Fish Board was formed in 1949 to give Alaskans a say in fishing regulations. One of its first actions was to say the prohibition against powerboats could no longer be justified. It ignored safety concerns. And they were right. The Bristol Bay sailboat fishery was the deadliest catch of its day, with a workplace mortality rate of sailboat fishermen 10 times the national average. With a growing pressure to change, the Fish and Wildlife Service proposed to abolish the powerboat restriction beginning in 1951. Although it was years in the coming, canners reacted with horror, calling it a sudden, unannounced, ill-conceived change of policy. But noting that the runs were on decline, they also admitted its failure as a conservation tool. Given a year to convert to power, the packers made a last stand to stop the change, arguing that explosion and fire aren't inherent problems on sailboats, which is probably right. Power failure, though, they said, could leave the present fishermen helpless. At the same time, local residents had a voice. The first Dillingham newspaper began printing in 1949. It was closely allied with the fishing unions, and they taunted the industry for trying to have things both ways. On one hand, the canners said the powerboats were so efficient that they were a conservation threat, but they were so inefficient, they would break down all the time. Then the industry got mean. The packers made an explicit threat to resident fishermen that powerboats would take away their newly found jobs, which would mean quick economic death and financial losses for Dillingham and the other canneries. They started a petition drive in hopes of showing local opposition to powerboats. Fistfights broke out in Naknek. In Dillingham, the few signers were dismissed as set netters and waitresses, subject to intimidation and bribery. The issue headed to a climax with a final set of hearings in November of 1950. Resident fishermen said it was all about money. Powerboats could break from the company's store. Sailboats were tied to the canneries as they were to their towboats, but an independent fisherman with a powerboat motor could motor off with a competitor. Al Andry testified that he just said, sailboat fish is cheap. That's why the industry doesn't want to change. Industry responded with a last-ditch attempt to guilt-trip the federal regulators, saying that allowing the power would risks the most valuable salmon fishery in the world. The decision ultimately came down to Interior Secretary Oscar Chapman, who weighed the evidence and concluded the ban was unjustified. It's been contended the conservation of the salmon runs would be threatened by such a technological advance, but the Fish and Wildlife Service now has sufficient enforcement capability and scientific knowledge to protect the runs against their depletion. So sailboat boats, the change came in 1951. Because the industry fought it so hard, only 86 fishing boats operated that year. But plans were on the drawing boards. And soon Bristol Bay powerboats were being mass produced. By 1952, 80% of the fleet was under power. The last sailboats fished commercially in Bristol Bay in 1954. How did things play out? Well, management wasn't compromised. There was little change in the effort levels or management strategy. True, the 1950 run was terrible, and the 50s were the worst decade in Bristol Bay history, but that wasn't due to powerboats. It was due to the inattention and passive management. That too is about to change. Ironically, while the industry stubbornly fought powerboats, they also hired the most progressive management biologist at the time, William F. Thompson from the University of Washington, to take a scientific look at the runs. The canners funded the Fisheries Research Institute. Thompson worked out practical ways to count escapement, the fish that get past, get up to the spawning grounds. And it ushered in a new age of fishery management. The economic fallout was more immediate. Resident fishermen flexed their muscle, created their own credit association to finance powerboats. Fishermen formed their own union. They picketed the canneries. Industry called it a dangerous situation. Dangerous for them, maybe. With the new power boats, freezer ship production increased tenfold. But the much touted freezer ship revelation largely fizzled. Back then, frozen fish ended up just being canned. It wasn't until a market emerged for frozen fish that freezer operations took hold. Faced with the new competition and weak runs and a newly empowered local force, several canneries closed their doors. The APA, the once great monopolists of Bristol Bay, had shrunk from 9 canneries to just 2. Having won the powerboat fight, local leaders set their sights higher. Union leader Truman Emberg from Dillingham helped write the Alaska Constitution. Harvey Samuelson, that young GI with the bazooka you saw earlier, became a leader in the Native Land Claims Settlement Act and one of the founders of the Alaska Federation of Natives and the Bristol Bay Native Corporation. Governor Ernest Greening sensed the change was about more than just, there you go. Faced with the new competition, Greening sensed the change was about more than just technology. It broke the long-standing monopoly that ruled Bristol Bay. It created jobs for local residents. It wasn't power. It wasn't power that propelled the boats, he said. It was the people who had the power in Bristol Bay. That was what really changed in 1951. Many of the sailboats converted to power as conversions. One was also used as a research vessel for UW. A few select have been preserved as museum pieces. This was at the South Naknek Cannery, and of course there's one here at APK. Others litter the ruins of the abandoned canneries, including those closed after the sailboat battle of 1950. You can still find them out on the tidal flats where the storm surge has tossed them decades ago. There's actually one that's sailing back to the bay from Homer to Naknek this year. He actually planned to do this in 2000, but it was stopped by the COVID virus. And we remember the other fisherman, Johnny Burnett, who won the lottery back in 1951 to help buy the first powerboat in Dillingham. He fished for over 50 years after that. John Nicholson fished for 64 years, half of them in a sailboat, and he preferred sail. Powerboats, he said, would allow every Tom, Dick, and Harry to fish. Both have since passed, but if you go out to the cemeteries in Bristol Bay today and look closely enough, you can still find them. On the cross, there's a memorial to the sailboats that they used, where the sailboat fishermen, some are simple depictions of a bygone era, and many have become obliterated by time. But these are powerful symbols that honor those who endured the incredible hard work under difficult and dangerous conditions. They mark a tipping point in Bristol Bay history when cannery towns cut their ties to the company store, and they bear witness to the last commercial sailboat fishermen in the Pacific. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, I'd urge you to come up front and use the microphone. If not, thank you all for coming. It's great to see a good crowd, and I hope you appreciated the program. Yeah.
I have a question. I was told once that the sails were all colored according to you would know which cannery it went to according to the color of the sail.
Actually, the hulls and the sails. The hulls mostly were all painted different. Peter Pan was white, others were blue, others were orange. It helped them keep control of where they're doing. And I think some of the sails too, but most of them were white.
If I might ask a question from back here, unless you insist that I come up front. But I'm just wondering, were the sail ships themselves, were they made by individuals, or were they mass-produced somewhere, or?
The questions were is whether fishermen built their own boats and the like, or were they mass-produced? And it's the latter. There were several companies that down in Seattle that specialized in the arcane art of building sailboats, and then they would ship them up. A lot of the boats, after they were used, were given away to Alaska Natives in the region, and many of them use them not just for commercial fishing, but for subsistence fishing in other parts of the year.
How's Bristol Bay fishery managed now, and is it managed well to avoid overexploitation?
It's very well managed by the Bristol Bay salmon fishery is very well managed by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. They have people who count the incoming runs to every river. They keep track of all the statistics, and it's doing quite well. Like I say, last year set a record run, a total run of 65 million fish, out of which they caught 45 million. This year, it's supposed to be 75 million. It's forecast. We'll see if that happens, and I hope it does. But at the same time, there's lots of concerns. Other salmon runs elsewhere in Alaska are doing poorly. Salmon in the Yukon-Kuskokwim region were down to zero in recent years. And scientists are trying to figure out exactly why that's taking place.
I'm just wondering, are most of the salmon runs sockeye in Bristol Bay?
Yes, all 5 species come back to Bristol Bay, but it's mostly the sockeye, and there's small numbers of chums, pinks, kings, and the like. But yeah, all the species come up, but it's by and large sockeye salmon. If nothing else, thank you again.